Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Spirit of Prophecy podcast. We have a very special episode for you today where we're going to do a review of the documentary After the Tribulation. Yes, all these years later, 13 years after the documentary has come out, we are going to do a review on it. I thought it would be interesting to go back and watch it again all these years later. The first time I saw it, I was somebody who was really on the fence when it came to the subject of pre-trib and post-trib. I wasn't real sure about a lot of things, and it was something that obviously had an impact on me, but I've not watched it since then. It has been years and years since I've seen it. I've learned a lot about the subject since then, and so I thought it'd be interesting to go back and watch it again and see what my thoughts are all these years later, now that I am very familiar with the subject. And so we're going to do a review on it. And I'm somebody who, for some weird reason, I enjoy watching movie reviews, and I thought I'd like to do some on documentaries. There's some that are coming out in the near future I'm excited to watch, and I planned on doing reviews of those. So I thought, let's go back and watch some old documentaries as well. And I think these are going to be the greatest reviews you will ever hear about Christian documentaries. And if you have some that you'd like me to watch, let me know. I've got several that I'm planning on doing, assuming anybody wants to watch them. Sometimes I do things just because I want to do it. I definitely want to do these, but if nobody cares, then I don't really care either. But I think you all will enjoy this, and I really hope you do. And if you do, make sure you like it, share it, and all that good stuff, and help it get out there. But I do believe I am somebody who is uniquely qualified to give an honest, unbiased opinion based on the content, rather than my emotional opinion, especially concerning the individuals involved. The IFB is neck deep in cancel culture, and it makes them incapable of looking objectively at anything. And we are not that way on this program. We will continue to trigger the cancel culture people by talking to the people that they will only talk about in their safe spaces, behind their pulpits, on their channels. We are not afraid to engage with the opposition, and we are not afraid to treat them fairly. We are not afraid to give an honest review of them, or we're not afraid to honestly represent the opposition. We don't feel that building straw men using ad hominem argumentation helps our cause. We are so confident in our beliefs. We are not afraid to fight fair. So that's what we're going to do on this program. So if you're expecting your typical IFB, just, cream the camp you're not in and support to the bitter end the camp you are in, that is not going to happen on this program. So, but having said all this, because much of my audience is IFB, I am going to give a disclaimer for the emotionally and intellectually weak individuals who might watch this review and get triggered by things that I might say. So my disclaimer: the opinions given about this documentary are just that, my opinions. Any positive things said about this documentary is not necessarily an endorsement of the documentary or the individuals featured in it. This documentary has been out for nearly 13 years and has had a large impact, and it should be able to be discussed in an honest way without people getting triggered like a blue-haired feminist. I am not responsible for any people who, as a result of me saying something positive about this documentary, watch it and get sucked into the new IFB and all its insanity. I cannot be held responsible for any bizarre behavior that comes from someone who, as a result of me saying something good about this documentary, goes on to drink any Kool-Aid. And finally, any negative thing I say about this documentary or the individuals involved is not an attack on soul winning. So there you go. Now let's get into the review. So this documentary was put together by Paul Wittenberger, and while I am not the artistic type who can explain in detail why something looks good and why something pleasant visually and all that type of thing, I can, as somebody who watches stuff, say, I think it looks good. I just can't tell you why. I can't give you those details. That I am not that type. I don't know the terms. But I will say Paul's come a long way in the last 12 years. While I think he did a great job putting this together, while I think the flow of it was very good, while I think it was engaging and the visuals and everything were good, in my opinion, I think if you compare it to his more recent documentaries, you will see he has come a long way. There's definitely an evolution in Paul's work. If you start from early ones like this, going into the later ones, he does continue to get better when it comes to all things visual, and I enjoy that. So when you look at this, it does look older, but I think too, for the time era and everything, it was some top-notch quality, and I think that's one of the reasons this had a big impact. I don't believe Steven Anderson was the first person out there saying things against the pre-tribulation position, promoting post-tribulation, but this was a very well-done documentary. This was not some cheap, lame presentation that was put together. This was a very well-done documentary. I believe this came out December 21st, 2012, which is awesome as a release date, because back then you had all the conspiracies about the Mayan calendar and how it ends at December 21st, 2012, and the end of the world was going to come. There was even a movie called 2012 about the end of the world. And so I like the confidence of making a documentary about the end of the world and releasing it when the world is supposed to end, which if they were right, nobody's going to be watching it. They're going to be too busy dying. But obviously, they knew that was not going to be the case. So I think that was a great choice in a release date. I like also how it started out talking about World War II and just kind of how it changed the course of history, how we rapidly during that time started working towards a one world government. We had the establishment of the UN in the 1940s. You have Israel becoming a nation in the 1940s. It really does seem like the 1940s is when things really kicked into high gear to get the ball rolling on the futurist vision of Revelation and how things are going to play out. It definitely seems like we are rapidly going towards that. And so they cover that in the beginning of the documentary. And, you know, historically, everyone has been newspaper theologians. You hear us talk about that a lot in this program. Everyone has always done that, where they have looked at the situation in their day and kind of read it into the scriptures. That is an honest critique. And sometimes people will say these things are self-fulfilling prophecies. And I can see that, for example, with Israel and Zionism, how that's kind of could be a self-fulfilling prophecy because so many Christians believe this needs to happen. We see them literally supporting it. However, and this documentary talks a lot about it, and I think it's effective, even though we agree with pre-tribbers about how it will look, we just disagree on whether we're going to be here for it or not. But the mark of the beast. The mark of the beast can't be a self-fulfilling prophecy because everyone who believes in a coming mark of the beast, microchip, that type of thing, we're all against it. We're all against anything that leads towards that kind of thing. And the fact that we are so rapidly moving towards something that in so many ways resembles what we see in Revelation, to me, it gives a lot of credibility to the way futurists interpret the book of Revelation. So I think it's very good that they covered that on this documentary, even though on a lot of the details about the mark of the beast and even our speculation, we would be in agreement with the pre-tribbers on it. But I think that was an effective thing to have in there too for any lost people who might watch this documentary, because they can see, you know, that we're moving towards one world government, mark of the beast, cashless society, all these things. So I'm very glad they included that in the documentary. I think that was a good choice. But after the tribulation, something that you do need to be aware of if you're wanting to recommend it to people, it is geared towards a specific audience. It's geared towards those who believe the mainstream evangelical position of eschatology, which is dispensational and pre-tribulational. That is the intended audience. This documentary would not necessarily be interesting for an amillennialist, preterist, partial preterist. They would just see all of us as being wrong. It's kind of a post-trib versus pre-trib documentary. And so because of that, because we are already in agreement with them on premillennialism, futurism, and that type of thing, it would have been pointless to spend a lot of time proving those things. That would have required way too much time. The documentary would have been way too long. But because of the fact those other groups, have such a very different way of looking at the scriptures, this particular documentary is going to be very hard for them to stay engaged with the whole time, because they're just going to see all of us as being wrong. It'd be like for me listening to a Calvinist and a dispensationalist debate Romans 9. I'm just going to get frustrated because they're both wrong on that. So it is geared towards a very specific group. And this documentary does not try to prove all the things that all of us in the futurist world agree on. It would have been a waste of time to do that. I think it was a good choice to stay away from that. Those of other persuasions will not be interested probably in this documentary. It is mainly geared towards premillennial futurists. And so there are some things that are brought up in there that could get some critique from other groups that are legit, but it would have required too much time to try to cover those things because they're never challenged in the KJV only futurist world. So the way Matthew 24 is applied, as far as how it's applied towards the future, okay, there's no disagreement in the futurist world on that. It's mainly with the partial preterists, the amillennials, and all that. So I'm glad they didn't get into that. I think that would have been such a big rabbit trail that it would have killed the flow of the documentary. But we're going to lose the preterists and amillennials and all those people on that part. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend this documentary to them. They're probably not just going to jump on board with it. There's too many other things you have to cover first with those people. But everyone in the premillennial futurist world, we all believe Revelation was written after 70 AD. We believe it is about future events that are in our future, that are on the world. We do not believe it is allegorical about the destruction of Jerusalem in the first century. So there's no need to even cover that because of the target audience. And I think that was good, that they did not waste time proving these things. They went right to going after the popular pre-trib position and then went on to show the much better post-trib and pre-wrath position. So in an hour and a half documentary, it's impossible to show an entire system of eschatology or even to just debunk another system completely. I think they did very well at hitting some of the best points for post-trib while also dismantling the main points of pre-trib. And the only, negative critique in a way that I would have, that's very easy to make this critique at 13 years later after seeing the impact of the movie. I wish early on they would have given maybe a short explanation of the post-trib pre-wrath position, of the timeline, and also I wish right away they would have hit the wrath and tribulation thing real quick, because while they definitely eventually cover those things, while they show that the tribulation just goes up to the sixth seal, sun being dark and moon turned to blood, while that is shown in there, because of when it's shown and because some of it's not as heavily emphasized as I would have liked, there are things that go over the head of a lot of pre-tribbers, especially early on, and it's easy for them to get lost. And I can say that too, because from experience, it went over my head. And I've talked to other pre-tribbers who, when being critical of it, they also, it was clear those things went over their head. And so those of us who are in the post-trib world and who are familiar with that position, we're going to watch a documentary. We're like, this is right on the money. This is right on the money. But at the same time, if you look at this documentary with the mindset of a pre-tribber, there are going to be some things that are a little confusing at first. And unless that pre-tribber is paying very close attention, taking notes, and unless they watch the whole thing, they're going to get lost and they're going to get the wrong idea. And because pre-tribbers, again, they are neck deep in the cancel culture, what happens with them, they see an error early on, and that gives them an excuse to dismiss everything. But if they would keep watching, they would see, well, wait a minute, no, this actually isn't an error. But they think it is because we use the word tribulation and wrath differently than the pre-tribbers do. So I wish that early on some things would have been addressed to just kind of help the pre-tribbers get their mind in the right place so we don't lose them. And I've had several pre-tribbers too that talk about, yeah, I started watching that and they made this mistake right away. I just quit watching it. Well, then please don't tell everybody that it was stupid and that it was wrong and that you can debunk it. No, you can debunk your misrepresentation of something, of a statement that you heard in the documentary, but you don't even know the position yet because you did not watch the whole thing. And so that's one thing looking back I wish would have been done a little bit different, because most pre-tribbers, they don't pay close attention to opposition. Most have never even been challenged on their own position. And so getting them to pay close attention, getting them to consider they're wrong, getting them to watch an entire documentary is very challenging. I have recently spoken with pre-tribbers who clearly had never been challenged by on their interpretation of certain things. They had never even heard the post-trib explanation on certain things. And it's always interesting, watching their reaction to these things. It's clear they've never heard this before. And that is the world of the pre-tribber. They live in a very major echo chamber where any dissenting voices are cut off and shut down very, very quickly. And so I do think, because of how some of it's laid out, it makes it very hard to get through in a world of people that are in a very strong echo chamber. And so, but I do think overall they made wise choices in the subjects to focus on. If you're a pre-tribber, you're still going to have many questions about certain things. Well, what about this? What about this? After the documentary. And I do believe how they can explain those things, but for time's sake, you can't cover everything. And so they did a good job of focusing on the strongest points of the post-trib position and nailing the weakest points of the pre-trib. They also, and this kind of surprised me too, it had been so long since I watched it, there was a bunch of things I assumed were on the documentary that I think what they were on was Pastor Anderson's Revelation series. And so there were some things I thought were on the documentary that when I went back and watched, it's like, oh, they don't even cover that on there. And I think it's good, because there are some arguments that post-tribbers use that I think are weak arguments. Some of them I think are even bad arguments. You can have a right position on something and still misuse a passage to prove it, or use bad reasoning and make bad arguments. And that's kind of happening in the post-trib world. They're kind of becoming like pre-tribbers. Pre-tribbers never challenge each other on anything. And so they kind of become more and more locked in and dogmatic about things that are clearly speculation. And even if you go back and watch some of Pastor Anderson's early preaching and his Revelation series, there's things that he will admit is speculation. But now it's like there's possibilities it could mean other things. But what his speculation is kind of becoming dogma in that world. And it's like, some of that's actually wrong. But now a lot of post-tribbers, they will act like pre-tribbers, and then they will violently defend those things. And let me just put a warning out for post-tribbers. Don't act like pre-tribbers. Do not lock yourself into an echo chamber. Learn to recognize what's clearly spelled out in scriptures versus what is speculation. And speculation has become sound doctrine in the pre-trib world, and it's starting to happen in the post-trib world, and we got to watch out for that. So, but in this documentary, they did not get into those things. They did not get into the way post-tribbers explain Daniel's 70th week, the way they apply Daniel's 70th week, I think hurts their own argument. Again, I still believe their position overall is right. However, the way they're trying to incorporate the prophecies of Daniel into future events, I think is hurting their argument. And so I'm glad that's not in this documentary. It would have given too many things for the opposition to just zero in on and use as a distraction. And so there's many things that post-tribbers teach that I would tend to agree with, but I often think too there's better ways to explain those things. I think too the way most post-tribbers apply certain things in Matthew 24 is correct. However, if you listen to how they explain a lot of the details, it's like, whoa, come on. That doesn't make any sense at all. And so while the basic premise is right, Jesus is coming back, that's still to come, the way they get there is a mess. And we don't want to give opposition distractions that they can focus on. And so this documentary doesn't do that. This documentary stayed focused on the strong points, and I think that's good. And so the fact they did this too is why a vast majority of the criticisms I've heard about this documentary over the years are like literal blue-haired feminist style criticisms where it's just them melting down, debunking straw men and mainly using ad hominem argumentation. That is the main criticism of this documentary, is they criticize the individuals in the documentary. They're not going to talk about the content. Even when I first started coming around in this subject, at the time I didn't know Pastor Anderson personally. I'd never spoken with him. I didn't even like him. But then when I would want to talk about not even the content of the documentary, but the subject, it always turned into a conversation about Pastor Anderson conspiracy theories. Always. Why? Ad hominem argumentation. Hey, I want to attack the messenger, but it's like, hey, Pastor Anderson didn't write Matthew 24. He didn't write the book of Revelation. Can we talk about what the Bible says? So no, they would use that as a distraction. And I think that's super lame. We should be able to talk about the content of a subject. We should be able to talk about a doctrine without it just being an attack on an individual. Is there a time to attack an individual? Of course. But you know what? If I find out that, John Calvin used to sneak into nursing homes and, knock over old ladies in their wheelchairs, that doesn't mean Calvinism's wrong. It means he's a terrible person, but it doesn't mean Calvinism's wrong. And if I am incapable of addressing the scriptures they use and addressing the arguments, and all I can do is talk about John Calvin and the way he treated old ladies in nursing homes, that just proves that I am distracting. And so that is the vast majority. I challenge you to go ask somebody, give a critique of After the Tribulation, and it's just going to turn into a Pastor Anderson bash. And it's why? Because the content on there is good. Or they might want to talk about something else they heard a post-tribber say. Okay, but it's like, wait a minute, is that in the documentary? No, they're not going to talk about the content of the documentary. They're going to bring up maybe something else weird that he's taught that's not in the documentary, that's not related to the documentary. So I think that's very interesting that is a vast majority of the criticism. But this documentary, it's also attacked quite often. I've heard many people melt down over the fact that they claim the 1830s is when the pre-trib position started being taught. Now, maybe they shouldn't have said no. I mean, they made some very absolute statements in there about no one teaching the pre-trib. I mean, I'm sure there was someone on the planet, someone historically that said something similar. But overall, in general, they were right in what they were saying, because when it comes to the specific language used, the terminology, the layout of events that pre-tribbers all use, you're not going to find it before 1830. It's just, you're not going to. And this is what they do. All the responses I've heard, and I've sat in places where they have been addressing these things, what they will do is they will show how they'll show the kind of the absolute statement that they made. And then what they will do is they will show exceptions in history. They will show historical Christian figures saying lines that sound like they agree with the pre-trib position. But let me explain to you why that is very dishonest when they do that kind of thing. As somebody who, again, is capable of actually analyzing the data, who actually knows how to spot an actual argument and knows a logical fallacy when he sees one, as somebody who will fact check what somebody says and not just believe them because they're on their side, let me just say I have gone back and I have looked at many of the quotes that they will use to show that some historical figure in Christianity believed in the pre-trib position, and you will find out they are always cherry picking a line that sounds similar. But what always happens, I challenge you, go find the line that they use and then go back and find where that's written and read everything they wrote on that. And you will find out that they often did not use certain terms the way we use them today. We do have religious lingo. There are ways we speak of things today that in other time eras, while they use those same words, because especially too, if those words in the Bible, they often were describing different things at the same time. And so, and one example they bring up all the time that just debunks this idea, this 1830s conspiracy, that is a total lie. How about Ephraim the Syrian? I did a whole podcast on this, but this is worth repeating. And they will read the translation from the Latin where he said, "For the elect shall be gathered prior to the tribulation. So they shall not see the confusion and the great tribulation coming upon the unrighteous world." Now, that sounds very pre-tribulation, right? However, if you read the rest of what he wrote in the Latin, or from the Latin translation in English, obviously I can't read Latin, you will find out he's not using the word tribulation the way we use it today. How do we use it today? The way Larkin used it, the way the dispensationalists used it. That's the way we use it today. That's not the way he used that word. In fact, if you start reading, like, wait a minute, he had a really weird belief. He's saying something very differently here than what we believe. And so if you look at the Syriac, when it's translated from the Syriac, it says, pronouncing the good fortune of the deceased, who have avoided the calamity. Blessed are you, for you were borne away to the grave, and hence you escaped from the afflictions. So, and you will see if you read everything that he wrote, and not just that one line, that these people who escaped this tribulation, it was people who were fortunate enough to die before it would happen. And if you read everything he wrote, it's clear that the events that you and I would call the tribulation, he thought we were here for. The people that he talked about that were escaping the great tribulation and that were being gathered prior to the tribulation were people who died. And they were fortunate enough to not see this horrific time. So folks, Ephraim the Syrian did not teach pre-tribulation doctrine. You can make a much better argument. He was much closer to our position. Obviously, there are some differences, but that is the case with many of the older writings. They use those terms differently than we do today. So they were right on that. That segment gets a lot of criticism, but I'm sorry, they were right. The way pre-tribbers speak about eschatology today is something that started in the 1830s. And I'm sorry, but that is just a fact. But, and let me just say this too. The way many post-tribbers today speak about things to come, you could say the way those things are spoken of, even many of the terms used, sentences used, arguments used, were popularized by Stephen Anderson. You could make that argument. It doesn't mean it was wrong, but yes, he did popularize a certain way of presenting things, a certain terminology. I have read many things that are much older, that predate all of us, that while the language was different, sounds very similar. In fact, I did a podcast on a Sword of the Lord article where They were going after the post-trib position. And when you read what they were addressing, it sounds a lot like what we are preaching today. However, certain things were termed differently. There was a different lingo that was used. And so Anderson definitely popularized a way to speak of things. And I'm not ashamed to admit that. I'm honest enough to admit it. Pre-tribbers aren't. And there was the very way they speak. It started in the 1830s. But the thing is, the concept of what they teach, you can't find it historically. The concept of how Anderson speaks today, you can find that historically, even if spoken of in a different way. So I did a whole podcast on theological language. So if you don't watch all the programs on the show, you're going to be behind on a lot of stuff I'm saying. But the subject of theological language, it's very interesting to me. One of the reasons we often accuse other people of heresy is we hear sentences come out of their mouth and we assume they define those words and use those words the same way we do. For example, too, some people, they hear somebody say repent of sins, they automatically think heretic. Like, why is that? Because when they hear repent of sins, in their mind, they're hearing the person say they've got to agree to quit sinning. Well, that's not possible, and that is works. But that's not what everybody means by that. So people use different lingo, or use different terms in different ways. You have to learn the language of the people that you're reading after, talking to, and pre-tribbers speak another language. And so I do think if early on in the documentary, they'd have been like, this is how pre-tribbers speak, this is how post-tribbers speak, and then explain that, because there's certain things get lost in translation early in the documentary, and it takes some time to figure out their language. And so when I read old timers, I get confused a lot because I've got to learn their language and how they spoke of things. So, I think it might have been beneficial to not speak in such an absolute way about that, but I do believe overall, in general, they were right. And so I'm sure you can find somebody historically who said something similar, but it is revisionist history to teach pre-tribulationism as a fundamental doctrine, which I've heard some people call it that. That is ridiculous. And so something that is worth noting about this documentary that I think they need some credit for this, they were calling out John Nelson Darby and Schofield before it was cool. Everybody's doing it now, but it was hard to find people back then calling out those guys. They did it before it was cool. Let's give them some credit there. I like also how they reference The Thief in the Night, the Left Behind series. And this is important because when you have something that's in your head and you realize, wait a minute, the Bible's not saying this, it's important that you find out how it got in your head. Because it's like, wait, I've got this in my head for a reason. And we all think the doctrine that's in our head, we got it strictly from the reading of the scriptures. And sometimes it is, but sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it was put there by other things. And there are the way most people envision the rapture, the coming of Christ and all that, it's not based on what they read in the scriptures, but the way it was portrayed in movies and books. And so if you can show people, hey, this is where that came from, what it'll do, they'll go back and they'll look at the scriptures again. You're like, yeah, it doesn't say that. Yeah, that scripture, you could say, there's multiple ways that could play out. We all saw the blue hairstyle meltdown that went down recently because I just said, hey, Revelation 7 is not clearly saying what we're saying it clearly says. We're reading that into that passage, and we saw full-blown blue hair feminist style meltdowns as a result of it. Because, and I'm just asking people, you got that in your head, where did it come from? And I will say for myself, it's mostly come from bad applications of other scriptures. Does not mean it's not true. Absolutely does not mean it's not true. It very well could be true. But what I had claimed in the past caused me to think that way, is not clearly saying that. And so we've got to be better about that kind of thing. And so again, one of the most important things this documentary did for me was showing the difference between tribulation and wrath. Because I was from the pre-tribulation world. Wrath and tribulation are the same thing. Not appointed unto wrath means not appointed unto 70 years of tribulation. That's what that means in that world. But that's not what it means in the post-trib world. And if we actually compare use of the words wrath and tribulation, with how it was used in Scripture, you will find pre-tribulationists are not using those words the way the Bible does. And so they're right on that. So something I missed the first time I watched this was how the sun being darkened and moon being turned to blood is what ends the tribulation and what begins God's wrath. That was a very important breakthrough for me. It's an important breakthrough for others. It is covered in the documentary. Again, looking back, I wish a little more emphasis would have been made on that and they'd have made a bigger deal about it, because it's one of those things that can kind of slip by you if you have the brain of a pre-tribber, which is what I had. And so again, the right information was in the documentary, but if greater emphasis would have been put on some of those key things, as a former pre-tribber and as someone who has talked to many current pre-tribbers and former pre-tribbers, I do think those arguments do have a big impact on people. So it's like, yeah, this was powerful for me. I wish more emphasis would have been put on there, because I think we would have gotten more people had that been emphasized a little more. And so I liked how they covered too, because this was something I just never thought about, but it's there in the Scriptures. But because we've had it in our head that these things are certain explained, they've been explained in certain ways, we just don't even challenge it. But I like how they covered how the seals are natural events while wrath is supernatural. Just showing a clear difference that, wait a minute, yeah, those seals are not necessarily Jesus pouring out his wrath. Maybe those seals are just showing John the things that were going to shortly come to pass. I mean, I don't know, that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? But that's not how we read that as pre-tribbers. That's not how we interpret that. But yet, at the same time, that very well could be what that means, and it seems to make sense, especially since we don't see God's wrath being mentioned until the 6th seal. When in the 5th seal, they're saying, how long dost thou not judge? That seems to tell me Jesus has not began judging them yet. Well, what are all these terrible things that are taking place? Showing them things that are going to come to pass. That seems like the plain reading of the book of Revelation. So I love too, I think it's very effective how they have a whole section showing how the word tribulation is used in the Bible. That is very good. I mean, Christians own tribulation, if you see that in the Scriptures. And I think that's a very powerful section. I think the discussion about the mark of the beast and the police state is good. And it's a helpful tool in getting the lost to see how real the Bible is. Because when it comes to our vision and how most of us would apply teaching about the mark of the beast, what we think it's going to look like, we're in agreement with the pre-tribbers on that. We just disagree about whether or not we're going to be here for it. But I think having this in the documentary was good to make it effective in reaching the lost, because the lost, they're able to see the police state, the one world government, the cashless society, all these things they're doing to control. And so when you compare these current events with what is in the book of Revelation, that's powerful for lost people who maybe didn't believe the Bible before, but when they see they predicted something so specific, that's effective. So even though a lot of the detail that was put on what the mark of the beast looks like and all that, we're in agreement with pre-tribbers, I think it was very important for them to keep that in there because of lost people who would watch this documentary. And so that was good. The end of the documentary, too, it explains a very harsh truth that no one would ever want to admit, but it's true. So let's listen to this clip that I think is very important, that accurately revealed why people were not changing And 13 years later, it is still true as to why many people have not changed on this subject.
I find that whenever I explain this to people who are in the pew, they have no problem understanding this doctrine. It's the people in the pulpit who will not face this doctrine, and I'll tell you why. The pre-trib rapture is the popular doctrine. If you want to be popular, you're going to preach the pre-trib rapture. You start preaching that the rapture comes after the tribulation, and you're going to be ostracized, you're going to be blackballed, you're going to be rejected from fellowship, because they do not want to change on this doctrine. Because there are people out there who have an agenda of making sure that nobody hears the truth on this doctrine. It's true. And the way that they keep this doctrine in the dark is through fear and intimidation.
So it is true. Normal people get it. Preachers don't, because it is a political thing. Baptists don't like hearing any call to change. But what they don't understand about much false doctrine is it typically comes in slowly. It creeps in. And it grows like leaven, and it can take years, decades, and even centuries before it fully manifests itself. And now, almost 200 years later, we have seen the results of pre-tribulation theology. First off, it has Christians supporting and encouraging wars and the slaughter of thousands for a land grab. That right there is a result of pre-tribulation theology. The fact that Christians are supporting that kind of thing, that shows how much that leaven is grown. It has Baptist preachers leaving prayers in walls of ancient fortresses, Roman fortresses. Many pre-tribulation, pro-Zionist Baptist preachers leave prayers in walls. Why? Because it's what the chosen people do in their mind. It has Baptists teaching people were saved by faith plus works and different dispensations. It has Baptists preaching the new covenant has nothing to do with the church and that the new covenant is still to come and it's just for Israel. Nobody told me these things when I was a pre-tribber. But yet these are things people brought up when I started challenging it. And understand, this is the result of that leaven that's grown. You're not going to find people preaching that 100 years ago. You weren't going to find Baptist preachers going to Israel even 50 years ago, leaving prayers in a wall. You know what happened, IFB? You changed. The IFB has changed. Now, you as an individual, you don't think you've changed. But that's because change comes in very slowly. It takes decades, generations, centuries. And you know what everybody needs, every group needs from time to time? They need a good old-fashioned Reformation. And if somehow I could flip a switch right now and I could make Liberty Baptist Church a perfect church, doctrinally, in 100 years, we're going to need reform in some areas, without a doubt. It's just the way these things go. And in the IFB, while they're constantly praying for revival, which typically means excitement, what they need to start praying for is reformation. That's what they really need. If they would have their reformation, I believe they would see their revival that they're talking about. But I like towards the end where Anderson explains how different the visual is of what the Bible teaches it will look like when Christ returns versus what the pre-trib teaches. And the pre-trib view of the coming of Christ is anything but a glorious appearing, which the Bible describes as a glorious appearing, because they have a secret rapture that they got from a thief in the night where we just disappear. Where that is not what the scriptures teach. And I like how he explained that on there. That was something too that was impactful for me, because I had in my head a vision of disappearing like that. And it forced me to go back and like, wait, why do I think we're disappearing? Where did I get that from? And I found out it wasn't in the scriptures. I traced it back to the Thief in the Night movie. That's in reality where it came from. And so I think that was good to have that. I think it kind of gave a strong end. I liked how during the credits, it had him singing "It Is Well With My Soul," which is a very post-trib song. And "Lord haste the day when my face shall be sight, the clouds be rolled back as a scroll." That's Revelation 6, where that happens. So I think that was good. The content of After the Tribulation is very good and very solid and has held up to scrutiny. And 13 years later, I still say, yes, the content is good. The content is accurate. Would I have emphasized some things differently in there, to help pre-tribbers more? Yes, I think so. But either way, hindsight's 2020 when it comes to those things. And so I've had many people who've asked me in recent year, in the last year, since a lot has been revealed about the new IFB, and they're always asking if they should recommend documentaries like After the Tribulation, Marching to Zion. And what I always tell people, I would only recommend it to spiritually mature people. I wouldn't use it to reach the lost. While the lost often are reached through things like end times, creation science, things like that, the best thing to do to reach the lost is just preach the gospel to them. Okay. Sometimes they get hooked by these things and it gets them looking, but either way, there are many carnal draws that the new IFB has that gets a lot of people in trouble. And so I wouldn't recommend it to somebody who's weak in the faith or even unsaved. And before you get mad at me, just understand that the two pastors featured in the documentary don't even recommend each other's churches anymore. So forgive me if I think they're both right and not recommending the other person's church. But again, if somebody is a spiritually mature person, who is capable of just judging the content without getting sucked into a movement, then yeah, I think it would be good. I think it would be very informative for them to watch this documentary. But somebody weak in the faith, especially if you think they're prone to just getting sucked into carnal things, I would not recommend it to them. And so I would also not recommend it to those of other persuasions like Amill, Post-mill, Preterist, all that. They're already familiar with like the Mark of the Beast stuff and how that's applied because that's so popular in the pre-tribulation world as well. But what they're just going to do is they're just going to criticize everything that's said in there because they're going to be like, they're all wrong because of, this preterist thing, this amillennial thing. But the documentary did not even try to prove futurism, premillennialism. And so it's not a fair criticism. I personally think if they wanted to cover those things, they could have and given a very strong case on those things. But they chose not to. And I think for good reason, because the Amills and all the preterists were not the intended audience. This documentary did seem to have an intended audience. And so I think the way they did it, it worked. And so Brother Paul, he did a great job on the documentary. It did make guys like Pastor Anderson and Pastor Jimenez come across in a very good way. And I think it's why a lot of people were drawn to them. Some of us, and I think many were drawn to the truth that they promoted. Some were probably drawn to the personalities. That's why you have to be careful about who you recommend it to. American Christianity is very man-centered. And this is something we struggle with in our American Christian culture. And that's why we do need to be careful about the content we consume. I do not think that everyone should just go listening to everybody's stuff that's out there because we are very prone to getting sucked into different things and being won over by personalities rather than content. So when it comes to this documentary, I would highly recommend to spiritually mature people, and I think they'll be fine. But no matter what you think of the individuals, the content of the documentary is great. It is presented well, looks great. If you get mad about that, I don't believe this weird demented application of a good tree bringing forth good fruit and the way people use that, where it's like anybody who does something good, everything they do has got to be good. And if somebody does something bad, everything they do has to be bad. You know what? Sometimes you get a little bit of both with people. And sometimes that bad can become too much to stomach and you have to move on from them. But you don't have to throw out the good that they taught. If Adolf Hitler said the sky was blue, the sky's still blue. We don't need to start calling it a different color. Okay? Sometimes people, they get that we don't like or care for or we think are bad in some ways, get certain things right. And so this is only a conflict for those who have been overly influenced by the American political mentality where everyone is in one of the two-party systems. And everything your party does is either all good or all bad. Learn to think like an individual. Learn to think objectively. And overall, I think it says a lot that 13 years later, that I would only make a few small changes. So I do believe the Lord used this documentary to shake things up in the IFB world on the subject of end times, and I will always be thankful for that. So I hope you enjoyed this review of After the Tribulation. Thank you for watching. Help me spread the word on it, and let me know if you like this. I do have several more documentaries that I would like to do reviews on, and so if you have some that you would like me to watch, let me know what they are, and maybe I'll check them out when I have time. So thank you for watching this. God bless. We'll see you all next time.